It started as a Sunday like any other. Birds chirped outside the sprawling Brentwood estate, the morning sunlight glinting off manicured lawns and polished marble. Inside, the air should have been warm with the hum of family life, the kind of ordinary, safe Sunday that millions of people take for granted. But for the Reiner family, that Sunday would mark the end of everything they thought they knew about safety, trust, and love. Within the walls of a $13.5 million mansion, something unfathomable had occurred, something that would shock the nation and leave people asking a question that has haunted true crime watchers for decades. How could a son kill his own parents? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Nick Reiner was 32 years old. His parents, Freeman and Michelle Reiner, were 78 and 70, respectively. The family had wealth, prestige, and a carefully curated public image of success and harmony. Yet, appearances can be deceiving. In that opulent Brentwood estate, tragedy unfolded in a way that few could have predicted. The bodies were discovered by Romy, the Reiner's daughter, a 27-year-old woman who walked into a scene that no human being should ever witness. Stab wounds, blood-soaked floors, a quiet so absolute that it almost screamed. She later told investigators about a dangerous family member, a warning that nobody heeded until it was too late. That member was Nick. He was arrested that very night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and his life, along with his family's, would never be the same. But what drove Nick to commit such a horrifying act? Was it a sudden fit of rage? A calculated plan fueled by resentment and greed? Or were there invisible pressures, unseen to the outside world, that had been building over decades, silently shaping a son into a killer? The answers are tangled in a web of wealth, secrecy, and betrayal, and the closer you look, the darker the story becomes. From the outside, the Reiners appeared to have it all: luxury cars, extravagant vacations, a social life that made headlines. Yet inside their home, the quiet tensions and unspoken grievances festered like a storm waiting to break. It's easy to assume that such crimes are the result of sudden madness or uncontrollable impulses, but the Reiner case challenges that assumption. Reports indicate that Nick had lived in the guest house on the property, a separate structure that was meant to provide privacy and independence. But was it also a stage for a long-simmering tension that nobody outside the family could see? Family members often warn each other about potential danger, yet in this case, those warnings went unheeded. Romy, the daughter, had sensed something wrong. She had identified a threat within her own home. She pointed investigators toward the truth, a truth that nobody wanted to confront. The enemy was not outside the estate, but inside it. Imagine walking into your own home and discovering that your parents, people who had raised you, nurtured you, and invested their entire lives in you, are gone. Forever. There's no recovery from that shock. Romy's ordeal was not just about discovering her parents' bodies. It was about grappling with the realization that her brother, her family, had become the perpetrator. The psychological weight of that knowledge is hard to overstate. For investigators, the crime scene was one of the most disturbing they had encountered in years. The combination of wealth, privilege, and a sudden, intimate act of violence created a narrative that was almost cinematic in its horror. Yet, real life is rarely neat, and in this story, it was terrifyingly messy. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media buzzed with speculation. Headlines screamed the shocking facts. Son arrested in brutal killing of parents was plastered across news sites, and every detail, no matter how minor, became a source of fascination. But while the world reacted with horror and disbelief, there were quieter, more subtle forces at play. Lawyers, investigators, psychologists, and family friends all tried to make sense of the impossible. They combed through emails, texts, financial records, and personal histories, searching for signs, for clues, for answers that might explain what should not have happened. Every detail mattered, and every revelation only deepened the sense of disbelief. How could a family with everything be destroyed from within? Understanding Nick's motives requires looking beyond the surface. Money, mental health, familial pressure, jealousy, or perhaps a combination of all three. Each element forms a piece of a puzzle that many are still struggling to fit together. Wealth can amplify existing tensions, creating stakes that are far higher than in the average household. In the Reiner case, it appears that the trappings of affluence were not enough to prevent tragedy. In fact, they may have obscured the warning signs, masking the undercurrents of danger until it was too late. This story challenges the assumption that money can insulate families from dysfunction. Here, it may have contributed to it. Equally perplexing is the public persona versus private reality. To outsiders, the Reiners were a high-profile family living a life of enviable luxury. But inside the estate, the veneer of perfection hid pressures and conflicts that were likely invisible to friends, neighbors, and colleagues. This discrepancy between appearance and reality is a recurring theme in cases of family violence. Yet few are prepared for it when it occurs at such a dramatic scale. It raises uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know our own families? What secrets might be lurking behind closed doors in even the most ordinary households? And, most chillingly, how can these hidden tensions erupt into irreversible acts of violence? Investigators, when asked, were careful to separate speculation from facts. Yet even the most cautious professionals acknowledged the complexity of the case. The involvement of Romy as the discoverer of the crime adds another layer of psychological trauma. She not only lost her parents, but also had to confront the horrifying reality of her brother's involvement. How does one process that level of betrayal? How do you reconcile the bond of family with an act so utterly destructive? The human mind struggles with such contradictions, and this story exposes those struggles in the rawest form. Even in the days following the murders, new information emerged that challenged initial assumptions. Witness accounts, digital footprints, and personal correspondences began to reveal a side of Nick that was perhaps not visible to the public. Reports hinted at tension, resentment, and even subtle warning signs that had gone unnoticed. It's a reminder that crimes of this nature rarely happen in isolation. They are the culmination of events, behaviors, and pressures that have been building over time. The Reiner tragedy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family dynamics, privilege, and the fragility of trust. And yet, despite all the horror, there is a peculiar fascination in trying to understand what drove Nick to this point. Human beings have an insatiable need to make sense of the senseless, to find patterns in chaos, and to reconcile the horror of violent acts with the context of daily life. In this case, every new revelation seemed to contradict the last, creating a story that was at once compelling and confounding. How could someone with so much love and support feel driven to commit an act of such ultimate betrayal? This is the question that will haunt investigators, journalists, and the public alike. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Reiner case is the finality of the outcome. The sentence is now final. Nick Reiner will face the consequences of his actions, yet the void left behind cannot be filled. There is no reversal, no do-over, no way to restore the lives that were lost. What remains are questions, speculation, and the haunting echoes of a family torn apart from within. The story is closed in the legal sense, but emotionally, it is unresolved, leaving a ripple effect that touches everyone connected to the Reiners, from immediate family to distant acquaintances and an entire community in shock. So as we begin to unravel this story, it is worth pausing to consider the deeper implications. This is not just a tale of murder. It is a study in human psychology, family dynamics, and the way secrets can fester until they explode in unimaginable ways. It is a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that wealth cannot shield against tragedy, and that even the closest bonds can be tested in ways no one could anticipate. And it is also a story of survival, of Romy, of investigators grappling with trauma, and of a society forced to confront the uncomfortable truths lurking behind the most luxurious facades. The questions linger. What truly drove Nick to murder his parents? Were there signs that everyone missed? Could intervention have prevented the tragedy? And most importantly, what does this story teach us about the fragility of family, the dangers of secrecy, and the consequences of unspoken tensions? As we dive deeper into the Reiner case, each chapter will reveal more layers, more contradictions, and more shocks, leading us closer to an understanding, but never fully allowing us to escape the chilling reality of what happened. Because the next revelations will challenge everything you think you know about this family. And what comes next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. From the outside, the Reiners seemed like the embodiment of everything people aspire to have. A sprawling $13.5 million estate in Brentwood, luxury cars lining the driveway, vacations to exclusive resorts, invitations to the kind of social events that made headlines. They had it all. To the world, Freeman and Michelle Reiner were the archetype of success and grace. Their children, Romy and Nick, were seen as heirs to that lifestyle, growing up in a bubble of comfort, opportunity, and social prestige. Yet, as with so many families who appear perfect on the surface, reality often tells a very different story. The mansion itself was a symbol of that outward perfection. Marble floors gleaming under sunlight, high ceilings adorned with intricate moldings, art pieces that had cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Guests would often marvel at the house, the landscaping, the meticulously maintained gardens. Every detail was curated, designed to impress, to signal status and achievement. But in the quiet corners of the estate, away from the eyes of the world, a different narrative was unfolding. Families, no matter how wealthy, carry tensions, rivalries, unspoken resentments, and expectations. And in the Reiner household, these undercurrents were more potent than anyone could have imagined. Freeman, at 78, was a man who had built his fortune through decades of meticulous effort. He was disciplined, demanding, and possessed a certain rigidity that many found intimidating, but which had earned him the respect of colleagues and peers. Michelle, at 70, complimented him with a poised social presence and an aura of calm control, often managing the household and public appearances with seamless efficiency. Together, they had cultivated a family that the outside world admired, yet their children saw a more complicated, sometimes tense, reality. Nick, their 32-year-old son, was known as charismatic and intelligent, but had a streak of unpredictability that had been apparent since adolescence. Friends and distant relatives sometimes spoke in hushed tones about mood swings, impulsive decisions, and behavior that suggested deeper struggles. Financial disputes, arguments over personal freedom, and clashes over expectations were not uncommon in the Reiner household. What the world didn't see were the small, repeated conflicts that built silently into a pressure cooker of resentment. Romy, the younger sister, was often described as the steady presence in the family. Diligent, compassionate, and intuitive, she was close to both her parents in ways that often contrasted with Nick's more complicated relationship with them. Yet even Romy could sense when something was amiss. In the months leading up to the tragedy, she had made subtle references to concerns about her brother, hinting at a level of danger that she feared was escalating. Her warnings were noted in private, but were never fully understood or acted upon. Even in families of immense wealth, the dynamics of favoritism, expectations, and unmet needs can take a toll. In the Reiner household, the visible markers of success masked deeper currents of tension. Nick, living in the guest house, had a physical separation from the main household, but the emotional proximity remained. Visits, conversations, and family interactions were fraught with a combination of affection, irritation, and unspoken resentment. How much of this was typical sibling rivalry, and how much was something more ominous, remains a question that investigators and psychologists have tried to answer. In exploring this family story, one cannot overlook the contrast between image and reality. Public appearances painted a picture of unity and sophistication. The Reiners attended charity galas, social functions, and networking events, always presenting themselves as an elegant, high-achieving family. Yet, behind the closed doors of their mansion, a different narrative was unfolding, one that included emotional volatility, financial pressures, and a complex web of expectations that may have been crushingly heavy for Nick to bear. Experts in family psychology often point out that wealth amplifies existing issues rather than creating them. Conflicts that might remain manageable in an average household can escalate dramatically when large sums of money, social status, and high expectations are involved. The Reiners were no exception. While the outside world marveled at their lifestyle, the private realities of control, pressure, and unspoken grievances were quietly intensifying. Nick's relationship with his parents had layers that few outsiders could see. On one hand, there was genuine care, shared history, and the bond of family. On the other hand, there was frustration, perceived criticism, and a sense of being trapped in expectations that he could not escape. These dynamics are often invisible until they erupt, and when they do, the results can be catastrophic. It is important to understand that even the most affluent, well-adjusted families are not immune to tragedy. The Reiners' wealth and status did not protect them from betrayal or violence. In fact, some argue that it may have contributed to the very conditions that led to the event. The carefully maintained image of perfection, the meticulous attention to appearances, and the desire to uphold a reputation can all create an environment where problems are hidden, unspoken, and allowed to fester. The day of the murders, that veneer of perfection shattered. Every detail that had once suggested security, stability, and love became irrelevant in the face of a violent act that no one could have predicted. The estate, with its gleaming floors and manicured gardens, would forever be marked as the site of a family tragedy that made national headlines. The very elements that made the Reiners appear untouchable, wealth, status, privacy, could not shield them from the human vulnerabilities that ultimately led to disaster. And yet, understanding the family's outward appearance is only the beginning. To grasp the full magnitude of what happened, we need to delve into the hidden conflicts, the subtle tensions, and the warning signs that were present long before that fateful Sunday. It is a story of contrast between luxury and violence, public image and private reality, love and betrayal. Every seemingly insignificant argument, every small misunderstanding, and every unspoken grievance contributed to a powder keg that ultimately exploded. As we continue, it becomes clear that the Reiners' story is not just about wealth or privilege. It is a study in human behavior, in the complex and sometimes dangerous interplay between family loyalty, personal ambition, and emotional instability. The cracks that had formed over decades were invisible to outsiders, but had been widening steadily beneath the surface. And in the end, those cracks were deadly. The question that haunts anyone studying this case is simple yet devastating. How did a family that seemed to have everything fail so completely from within? How did the Reiners, who appeared to epitomize success, love, and sophistication, become the setting for a murder that shocked the nation? And most importantly, what were the warning signs that could have prevented this tragedy, and why were they ignored? The story of the Reiners is just beginning. Behind the mansion walls, within the carefully controlled appearances, lies a tale of tension, resentment, and danger that had been growing silently for years. And what comes next would reveal the first cracks in that facade, the subtle signs of conflict that, if noticed earlier, might have changed everything. But the first question we must answer is this: what truly made the Reiners appear perfect, and why was that appearance so dangerously misleading? The next chapter will take you inside the lives of Freeman, Michelle, Romy, and Nick, to see not the public image, but the private reality of a family whose story would end in unimaginable tragedy. It was a Sunday morning that began like any other, but by the end of the day, the Reiner family home would be transformed from a place of comfort into a scene of horror that would haunt Brentwood forever. The estate, which had always been a symbol of wealth, security, and familial achievement, became a grim reminder that appearances are often deceptive. What unfolded that day is the kind of tragedy that people struggle to comprehend, the kind that seems almost impossible until the details are laid bare. The morning air was crisp, the sunlight glinting off the polished driveway of the mansion. Birds chirped, leaves rustled gently in the wind, and the world outside seemed perfectly ordinary. Inside, Freeman and Michelle went about their Sunday routines, unaware that this day would mark the end of their lives. Perhaps they had breakfast together, discussed plans for the day, or simply enjoyed the quiet comfort of a home they had built over decades. These small, mundane moments, ordinary in every sense, would become hauntingly ironic in hindsight. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner, who lived in the guest house on the property, was in a separate part of the estate. The guest house provided both independence and distance, a buffer from the constant expectations of living in the main mansion. But that distance did not shield the family from the tragedy that would unfold. By all outward appearances, everything seemed normal. There was no warning siren, no clear signal that Sunday would end in such violence. Yet, The events leading up to the crime had been quietly building, like an invisible storm gathering strength beneath the calm surface of the Reiner estate. The discovery of the bodies came in the most shocking way imaginable. Romy, the 27-year-old daughter, entered the home and found her parents stabbed to death. The sight was so horrifying that it is difficult to convey the full emotional impact in words. Blood stained the floors, furniture, and walls. The serenity of the mansion was replaced by chaos and horror. In that moment, Romy's life changed irrevocably. She would carry the memory of that scene forever, along with the knowledge that her brother was the one responsible for the carnage. Romy's immediate reaction was a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. She called the authorities, providing them with a crucial piece of information, a warning about a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. Her instincts were tragically accurate. Investigators later confirmed that Nick had been involved in the murders, and his arrest that night began a legal saga that would capture national attention. Romy's discovery was not only the first step in solving the crime, it was also the first confrontation of a terrifying truth. The threat had come from within. When the police arrived, they were faced with a scene that tested even the most experienced officers. The combination of wealth, scale, and personal betrayal made it unlike typical cases. Every detail was meticulously documented: the positions of the bodies, the nature of the wounds, the layout of the home, and the guest house where Nick lived. Investigators noted that the physical separation of the guest house had done nothing to prevent the tragedy. In fact, it may have allowed for a sense of isolation that facilitated the crime. In the hours that followed, media outlets began reporting on the story. Headlines screamed the shocking facts: son arrested in Brentwood double murder, Reiner family tragedy, wealth and violence collide, Nick Reiner charged with first-degree murder of parents. Social media exploded with speculation, theories, and grief. People were drawn to the story because it challenged fundamental assumptions about family, safety, and trust. How could such a crime occur in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country? How could a son commit such an act against his own parents? While the world reacted with horror, those closest to the family began grappling with the psychological and emotional impact. Friends, relatives, and colleagues struggled to reconcile the public image of the Reiners with the private reality revealed by the murders. Many expressed disbelief, claiming that the family seemed perfect, while others quietly acknowledged that wealth and privilege do not immunize anyone from human frailty. The dissonance between perception and reality would become a central theme in understanding this tragedy. Investigators quickly began piecing together the timeline of events. They examined phone records, digital communications, financial transactions, and personal interactions to understand what had led to this horrific day. Every clue mattered, every small detail potentially significant. They interviewed Romy extensively, seeking to understand what she had observed, what she knew, and what warnings she had received about her brother. Her testimony became crucial, providing insight into the family dynamics and the subtle tensions that had been simmering for years. As the investigation progressed, one of the most unsettling aspects became clear. There were signs of underlying tension that had been invisible to outsiders. Nick's behavior in the days leading up to the murders suggested stress, agitation, and possible planning. Reports from neighbors, acquaintances, and family friends hinted at small incidents that, when viewed in isolation, seemed inconsequential. But in hindsight, these incidents formed a pattern, a prelude to the catastrophic events of that Sunday. The psychological weight of the discovery cannot be overstated. Romy, who found her parents, now faced the impossible task of processing both grief and betrayal. The trauma of losing loved ones in such a violent manner was compounded by the realization that her own brother had caused the deaths. Mental health professionals who later examined the case noted that family members often struggle more profoundly when the perpetrator is someone close, someone trusted, because it challenges basic assumptions about safety and loyalty. The Reiner tragedy exemplified this phenomenon in its most extreme form. The day also revealed the complexities of wealth and privilege in tragic circumstances. The Reiners' affluence had allowed for physical separation within the estate, legal protections, and privacy from the public eye. Yet, these same factors may have contributed to the environment in which the crime occurred. Isolation, combined with unresolved tensions, created conditions in which violence could erupt. This is a critical observation for understanding the intersection of wealth, family dynamics, and human behavior. By evening, Nick Reiner was taken into custody. The arrest marked the beginning of a legal process that would dominate headlines and public attention for months. It also forced a broader reckoning with the question of motive. Was this a spontaneous act, a moment of uncontrollable rage? Or had it been carefully planned, a calculated betrayal fueled by complex emotions and personal grievances? Analysts and psychologists debated these questions, and the answers would later emerge in ways that were both illuminating and horrifying. The public, of course, had its own interpretations. Social media discussions ranged from outrage to morbid fascination, with theories about motive, family secrets, and mental health proliferating at an astonishing pace. Yet, as always, the surface speculation could not fully capture the reality of the situation. Behind the mansion walls, in the private spaces of the Reiner estate, the interplay of emotion, expectation, and resentment had culminated in a tragedy that was far more nuanced than headlines could convey. This was more than a crime story. It was a study in human psychology, family dynamics, and the way that hidden tensions can explode into catastrophic violence. The events of that Sunday were the result of years of emotional pressure, unspoken conflict, and complex interpersonal relationships. Understanding the Reiner murders requires examining not just the actions of the day itself, but the decades-long patterns that set the stage. And yet, even as investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct the timeline and motives, one question loomed over everything. Why? Why did Nick choose to commit such an irreversible act against the people who had given him life, security, and opportunity? What pressures, resentments, or psychological factors had pushed him past the point of no return? These questions would dominate the investigation, the trial, and public discourse, and they remain central to understanding the tragedy in its full scope. The day that began like any other ended with irrevocable loss. The Reiner family, long admired for its wealth, sophistication, and apparent unity, was forever changed. What started as a routine Sunday had turned into a narrative of violence, betrayal, and unanswered questions, a narrative that would continue to unfold in the coming chapters of this story. And as the sun set on the Brentwood estate that day, one truth became clear. Nothing would ever be the same, and the events of that Sunday would mark the beginning of a tragedy that would capture the attention and fascination of the nation. But what came next? The investigation, the revelations, and the shocking details of the family's private life would change everything again in ways no one could have predicted. To understand how a son could commit the unthinkable act of murdering his own parents, we must start with the man himself, Nick Reiner. 32 years old, he was the youngest child in a family that, on the surface, seemed to have everything. Yet, appearances often conceal complexities, and in Nick's case, the layers of personality, upbringing, and personal struggles reveal a portrait that is both troubling and deeply human. Nick was born into privilege, the son of Freeman and Michelle Reiner, in an environment where wealth was abundant and expectations were high. From the start, he had opportunities most could only dream of. Elite schools, private tutors, and access to social circles that opened doors at every turn. His parents had invested not just financially, but emotionally, nurturing a child they hoped would thrive, succeed, and carry the family legacy forward. Yet, privilege does not always equate to stability, and for Nick, the pressures of living up to such expectations may have been an invisible burden. Early childhood accounts describe Nick as curious and energetic, traits that are generally endearing. Yet, there were hints of volatility even in these formative years. Teachers occasionally noted mood swings and difficulty managing frustration. At home, interactions with his parents were a mixture of affection and tension, moments of genuine connection contrasted with episodes of conflict. While this might seem typical for a child navigating adolescence, patterns of unresolved anger and simmering resentment can, over time, create profound emotional turbulence. Nick's adolescence was marked by both promise and challenges. Academically, he excelled in certain areas, showing aptitude in subjects that required analytical thinking and creativity. Socially, he could charm peers and adults alike, displaying charisma that masked deeper insecurities. Friends and family members who later spoke about him painted a complex picture, a young man capable of warmth and generosity, but also someone prone to impulsive decisions and moments of intense frustration. These traits, when combined with familial pressure and personal expectations, may have set the stage for future conflict. As Nick transitioned into adulthood, the family dynamics shifted in subtle but significant ways. Living arrangements changed. He moved into the guest house on the Brentwood estate, a structure designed to provide independence yet maintain proximity to his parents. While this arrangement allowed for physical space, it did not resolve emotional tensions. Nick's relationship with his parents remained complicated, a blend of loyalty, dependency, resentment, and occasional defiance. In some ways, the guest house became a symbolic boundary between autonomy and expectation, a space where freedom and isolation coexisted uneasily. Mental health factors also appear to have played a role in Nick's development. Sources indicate that he had struggled with anxiety and mood regulation, conditions that can be exacerbated by environmental stressors, family pressure, and personal disappointments. While these challenges alone would not explain violent behavior, they provide context for understanding his psychological landscape. Experts in family dynamics and criminal psychology often note that untreated or poorly managed mental health conditions, when combined with long-standing familial tension, can contribute to a heightened risk of extreme actions. Nick's relationships outside the family also offer insights into his character. Friends and acquaintances reported a person who could be charming and engaging, yet prone to withdrawal and secrecy. Financial disputes, disagreements over responsibilities, and occasional arguments with extended family members suggest that he had difficulty navigating social and familial expectations. In a household already marked by high stakes and intense scrutiny, these personal struggles may have intensified feelings of frustration, isolation, or resentment. Financial considerations may have also been a source of tension. Living in a household of immense wealth brings both advantages and pressures. Nick had access to resources, but was likely acutely aware of expectations regarding his contribution, responsibility, and behavior. The perception of favoritism, disparity in privileges among siblings, or disagreements about inheritance can strain even the strongest family bonds. While investigators have not fully confirmed these factors as direct motives, they provide a framework for understanding the potential sources of conflict within the Reiner family. It is important to consider Nick's behavioral patterns leading up to the tragedy. Friends, neighbors, and family members noted changes in mood, unusual behavior, and signs of agitation in the weeks prior to the murders. While none of these observations definitively predicted violence, they point to a pattern of escalating stress and emotional instability. Combined with long-standing familial tensions, these patterns create a portrait of a young man under immense pressure, struggling with internal conflict, and increasingly isolated from the very people he was closest to. In examining Nick's background, one also notices the paradoxes in his personality. He could be thoughtful, reflective, and even compassionate, yet simultaneously impatient, impulsive, and prone to anger. These contradictions are common in complex individuals, but when layered with environmental stressors, high family expectations, wealth, isolation, and unresolved grievances, they can become volatile. Psychologists studying the case have suggested that Nick's ability to compartmentalize emotions may have allowed tensions to build unchecked, eventually culminating in the violent act that shocked the nation. Nick's upbringing also underscores a central theme in this story: the tension between appearance and reality. On the outside, he lived in a household of perfection, surrounded by luxury and opportunity. Yet inside, emotional currents ran deep and turbulent. Privilege cannot insulate someone from family conflict, nor can it prevent the accumulation of resentment, frustration, or perceived injustice. The more visible the family's success, the greater the contrast when those dynamics erupt into tragedy. Ultimately, Nick's background provides both context and contrast. He was a man shaped by opportunity, expectation, and complex emotional influences. He had the tools to succeed, yet he also carried invisible burdens, struggles that few outside the family could perceive. Understanding these elements is crucial to comprehending not just the crime itself, but the environment in which it occurred. As we trace the events leading up to the murders, it becomes clear that Nick's background was not a simple narrative of good or evil. It was layered, complicated, and filled with contradictions, a reflection of the very human struggle between aspiration and limitation, love and resentment, loyalty and rebellion. These forces converged in ways that were tragically destructive, setting the stage for the events that would unfold in the Brentwood estate on that fateful Sunday. And yet, even with this understanding, questions remain. What specifically triggered the act? Were there unmistakable signs that went unnoticed by friends, family, or professionals? How did a son so deeply enmeshed in his family's life come to commit an act of ultimate betrayal? The answers to these questions are hidden in the complex interplay of personality, environment, and circumstance, and they will become clearer as the story unfolds. The next chapter will delve into the motives and suspicions that surrounded Nick Reiner, the factors that may have driven him to commit a crime that no one could have imagined, yet, in hindsight, were quietly building beneath the surface. The question that haunted investigators, family members, and the public alike was simple yet devastating. Why? Why would a son kill the very people who had given him life, nurtured him, and provided him with opportunities that most people could only dream of? The answer, as the investigation began to reveal, was not simple. It was tangled in layers of family dynamics, emotional tension, financial concerns, and psychological strain. Motives, in cases like this, are rarely singular. They are multifaceted, often contradictory, and sometimes, ultimately, unknowable. From the start, investigators focused on both the obvious and the subtle potential motives. Financial considerations were immediately scrutinized. The Reiner estate was valued at $13.5 million, a fortune that created both opportunity and tension. Did money play a role? Could resentment over inheritance, perceived favoritism, or control of assets have driven Nick to act? While investigators were cautious not to jump to conclusions, the mere presence of immense wealth within a family creates fertile ground for conflict. The patterns of human behavior in such households often reveal that financial disputes, while sometimes mundane, can be intensely personal and emotionally charged. But the financial lens alone was insufficient. Those closest to the Reiners spoke of underlying familial tensions that had been present for years. Nick's relationship with his parents, particularly with his father, was complicated. Freeman Reiner was known for his discipline and high expectations. While such traits may have fostered success and ambition in many, they also created pressure, particularly for a son prone to mood swings and emotional volatility. Nick's interactions with his parents were often marked by a push-and-pull dynamic, moments of loyalty and affection intertwined with conflict and frustration. Psychological and emotional factors played a critical role in forming the framework for understanding Nick's motives. Experts in criminal psychology have long noted that acts of familial violence are often preceded by a combination of personal grievance, perceived injustice, and psychological strain. In Nick's case, mental health concerns, documented mood swings, and signs of emotional instability created conditions in which resentment could grow unchecked. Over time, these internal pressures can become magnified, especially in environments where external stressors, like high expectations, wealth, and familial scrutiny, are present. Some accounts suggest that Nick may have felt trapped by expectations and responsibilities placed upon him. Living on the estate in a separate guest house provided physical space, but emotional proximity remained unavoidable. Every interaction with his parents, however mundane, may have reinforced a sense of confinement or judgment. Experts suggest that in high-pressure environments, feelings of being trapped, unheard, or undervalued can accumulate, ultimately leading to explosive outcomes. The role of personal grievances and perceived slights cannot be overlooked. Families, particularly those under intense scrutiny or with histories of wealth and status, often accumulate layers of unspoken conflict. Nick's relationships with his parents and siblings included moments of friction over autonomy, recognition, and approval. While these conflicts were, on the surface, typical of any family, They existed within a high-stakes environment where small irritations could escalate dramatically. Investigators noted that unresolved disputes, when combined with other stressors, can create a psychological landscape in which extreme actions seem, to the actor, like the only solution. It is also important to consider the role of secrecy and private tensions. Wealthy families often maintain appearances for social and public consumption, masking disagreements, resentments, or difficulties that are present in daily life. The Reiners, admired by friends and neighbors, were no exception. The public facade of harmony obscured undercurrents of dissatisfaction and interpersonal conflict. Investigators repeatedly emphasized that the gap between perception and reality was critical in understanding the motive. The world saw a family that had it all, but behind closed doors, conflicts festered, unnoticed or ignored. Furthermore, Nick's own statements and behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders suggested internal turmoil. Witnesses reported mood changes, agitation, and withdrawal from social interactions. Experts have noted that these behavioral shifts often precede violent acts, particularly when individuals feel overwhelmed, misunderstood, or resentful. While such observations are not definitive predictors, they are significant pieces of a broader pattern. Suspicion inevitably fell on Nick from the very beginning, due in part to both his presence on the property and Romy's statement regarding a dangerous family member. Investigators considered alternative scenarios. Could an outsider have been involved? Were there external threats or intruders? Every angle was explored, yet the evidence consistently pointed inward. The internal pressures, the combination of personality traits, family history, and situational factors, converged to place Nick at the center of the investigation. The media also speculated widely about motive, often blending fact with conjecture. Headlines focused on wealth, family conflict, and psychological instability, creating a narrative that was both compelling and sensationalized. While this coverage provided public context, it sometimes obscured the more nuanced, complex reality of familial relationships and psychological dynamics. For those studying the case seriously, the challenge was to separate sensationalized speculation from plausible, evidence-based motives. Even with the investigation underway, some contradictions emerged. Nick, while implicated and later arrested, had moments of seemingly ordinary behavior, interactions that contradicted the darker picture being painted. Friends and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the charming, social individual they knew with the person capable of murder. These contradictions are common in cases of familial homicide, underscoring the complexity of human behavior and the difficulty of predicting extreme acts. Yet, despite these contradictions, the overarching pattern was clear: a combination of financial pressures, psychological instability, familial tension, and unresolved grievances created conditions that made violence possible. No single factor can explain why Nick acted as he did, but together, they form a portrait of escalating pressure that ultimately erupted in tragedy. What investigators continued to seek were the final triggers. The events or emotions that pushed Nick from internal tension to violent action. Was it a particular argument, a financial dispute, or a perceived insult? Or was it the culmination of years of simmering resentment, where no single event mattered as much as the cumulative weight of expectation, judgment, and isolation? These questions remained central to understanding the full scope of the crime. As the investigation unfolded, law enforcement discovered early evidence of planning and premeditation. Certain actions suggested that the act was not entirely impulsive. Instead, it reflected a moment where opportunity, emotion, and long-standing grievances converged. Psychologists and criminologists would later analyze this pattern, noting that familial murders often involve a mix of impulsive violence and underlying preparation, a chilling combination that makes prevention difficult. And yet, while motives were being pieced together, one element remained stubbornly unclear: the precise role of emotional bonds. Love, loyalty, resentment, and anger coexist in complex ways within families. Even in the most extreme acts of violence, these bonds do not simply disappear. Understanding Nick's emotional state, his perception of betrayal, his fear, his frustration, is crucial to comprehending why someone might act in a way that seems incomprehensible from the outside. The story of motive, therefore, is not linear. It is a web of interrelated pressures, emotions, and circumstances, each amplifying the other. Financial concerns intersected with family dynamics, psychological struggles intersected with social pressures, and years of unspoken tension finally reached a breaking point. The tragedy of the Reiner family is that these elements, individually manageable, converged at a moment when the result was irreversible. And as investigators continued to unravel this complex web, one fact became increasingly clear. The events of that fateful Sunday were not merely the product of opportunity or impulse. They were the tragic outcome of a long-standing, intricate, and deeply human interplay of factors that, when combined, created a situation from which there was no escape. But what exactly happened on that day? The series of moments that transformed tension into violence would shock even those who had been following the story closely. And what came next? The unraveling of the crime scene, the investigation, and the discovery of hidden details would reveal truths about the Reiner family that no one could have anticipated. When law enforcement arrived at the Reiner estate, they encountered a scene that would haunt even the most seasoned officers. The mansion, with its gleaming marble floors, manicured gardens, and air of refinement, had been transformed into a tableau of violence and tragedy. Every detail, from the arrangement of furniture to the splatters of blood on the walls, told a story of chaos that contrasted sharply with the curated perfection the world had always associated with the family. The bodies of Freeman and Michelle Reiner were found in the main house, both victims of multiple stab wounds. The brutality of the act left no doubt that this was more than a crime of impulse. The violence suggested a level of personal anger and familiarity that is almost impossible to stage. Investigators noted the intimate nature of the crime, observing that the wounds indicated rage, precision, and, chillingly, intent. This was not a random attack. The perpetrator knew the victims, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. Romy's discovery of the bodies added a human dimension to the crime scene that cannot be overstated. She had entered the home expecting an ordinary Sunday, only to be confronted with a nightmare. Her immediate response, calling authorities and identifying a dangerous family member, became pivotal in directing the investigation. In addition to the physical evidence, her testimony provided insight into the psychological and relational dynamics of the household. Romy's presence at the scene underscored the horror of the situation. The crime was not just an abstract event. It had immediate and profound consequences for surviving family members. The guest house, where Nick lived, became an area of intense scrutiny. While he was not in the main house at the time of discovery, evidence suggested his proximity to the crime and potential involvement. Investigators meticulously documented every aspect of the property. Doors, windows, security systems, and possible entry and exit points. The layout of the estate itself became a critical factor in understanding the sequence of events. The spatial dynamics, the separation between guest house and main house, played a dual role. It provided physical distance, but could not prevent the escalation of familial tension that culminated in violence. Forensic teams worked for hours, combing through evidence to reconstruct the timeline. Blood spatter analysis, fingerprints, and other physical traces revealed patterns that helped identify the sequence of events. The thoroughness of the investigation highlighted not only the brutality of the act, but also the meticulous approach required to piece together the tragedy. Each detail, from the placement of objects to the trajectory of wounds, contributed to a narrative of calculated, personal violence. Investigators also noted signs that suggested a struggle. Furniture displaced, subtle marks on walls, and other indicators hinted at resistance and conflict. These elements painted a picture not only of the act itself, but of the emotional intensity that accompanied it. This was a crime committed in anger, frustration, and perhaps desperation, emotions that had been building over years of unresolved family tension. The physical evidence mirrored the psychological landscape of the Reiners, carefully managed on the surface, but turbulent beneath. The crime scene also raised questions about the role of wealth and security in the family's tragedy. Despite the presence of state-of-the-art security systems, private spaces, and physical separation, the measures intended to protect the family could not prevent the act of violence. This highlighted a critical insight for investigators and psychologists. External protections, while effective against intruders, are powerless against threats that originate within. The human element. Emotions, resentments, and interpersonal conflict was the real vulnerability, and no amount of wealth or security could mitigate it. Evidence collection extended beyond the immediate areas of violence. Investigators examined Nick's personal spaces, seeking items that could clarify his mental state, intentions, and potential motives. Documents, electronic devices, and personal correspondences were analyzed for patterns of thought, expression of frustration, or planning behavior. Each discovery added layers to the emerging profile of the perpetrator, revealing a complex interplay of emotion, cognition, and intent. The media coverage of the crime scene was intense, although investigators carefully controlled the release of information to prevent compromising the investigation. Still, the public perception was shaped by the shocking contrast. A luxurious mansion, a seemingly perfect family, and an act of unthinkable violence. This tension between appearance and reality would become a recurring theme in the coverage of the Reiner case, emphasizing how outward affluence and social status do not shield against internal conflict and human fragility. One of the most haunting aspects of the scene was the immediacy of the human element. Romy's reaction, her confrontation with the evidence, and the subsequent trauma underscored the psychological devastation that accompanies familial homicide. Survivors of such crimes often experience intense guilt, confusion, and lasting emotional scars. Romy's position as both witness and family member made her trauma uniquely complex, intertwining grief with shock, anger, and the challenge of processing a reality that defies comprehension. As the day unfolded, investigators began constructing a more detailed timeline. Interviews with neighbors, staff, and acquaintances helped clarify movements, interactions, and potential triggers. Even small details, a sound heard by a neighbor, a delivery that arrived unnoticed, or a conversation overheard, became pieces of the larger puzzle. These fragments, when assembled, offered insights into the circumstances leading to the crime, revealing a narrative that combined opportunity, motive, and emotional intensity. The crime scene also underscored the importance of professional forensic analysis. Every mark, stain, and trace of evidence had to be documented, photographed, and examined to ensure the accuracy of the investigation. Blood spatter patterns, wound trajectories, and positioning of the bodies offered clues about the sequence of events and the dynamics of the struggle. Forensic psychologists used this information to interpret not just the physical actions, but the emotional and cognitive state of the perpetrator. As the evidence accumulated, one thing became abundantly clear. This was not a spontaneous act of violence in the abstract. It was deeply personal, targeted, and intimate. The patterns suggested planning and intent, a convergence of long-standing tension and immediate opportunity. The scene was more than a snapshot of brutality. It was a window into a family's hidden dynamics, their unspoken conflicts, and the emotional pressures that had been accumulating over years. Yet, even with meticulous investigation, there were questions that remained unanswered. How long had these tensions been building? What specific interactions or events immediately preceded the murders? Were there signs that could have been noticed, acted upon, or mitigated? These uncertainties highlighted the complexity of human behavior, particularly in situations where personal relationships, emotional bonds, and psychological factors intersect with wealth and privilege. The Brentwood estate, once a symbol of safety, luxury, and familial pride, had become a locus of tragedy and inquiry. The crime scene offered evidence of both physical and emotional violence, a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences when human relationships unravel. As investigators continued their painstaking work, the story began to emerge, a story of opportunity, grievance, and ultimately, betrayal. And yet, even as the facts of the crime scene were documented, one truth lingered: the human element, the emotions, decisions, and internal struggles that led to this violence, could not be fully captured in photographs or reports. Understanding why this act occurred required delving deeper into the minds and motives of those involved, exploring the psychological, social, and familial currents that culminated in tragedy. What came next? The personal perspectives, testimonies, and psychological insights would reveal aspects of the Reiner family that the world had never seen. And those revelations would make the horror of the crime scene seem only the beginning of the story. No one could have fully prepared Romy Reiner for the sight that awaited her that Sunday morning. 27 years old, the youngest daughter in a family that outwardly seemed perfect, Romy had grown up within the carefully managed world of the Brentwood estate. She knew her parents intimately, their routines, their habits, their expectations, yet nothing in her life had prepared her for the violence she would witness. In a single moment, her world shifted from familiarity and security to horror, grief, and incomprehensible betrayal. Romy had entered the mansion that morning with no suspicion that tragedy awaited. Like many, she may have expected a quiet Sunday, perhaps a breakfast with her parents, a conversation about plans for the day, or the comforting routines that define family life. But instead, she was confronted with an unimaginable scene. Her parents, Freeman and Michelle Reiner, stabbed to death. The bloodied rooms, the stillness, the absolute finality of what she saw. These are the kinds of experiences that imprint on the human psyche, leaving psychological scars that endure long after the physical evidence is cleared. Her immediate reaction was a mixture of shock, fear, and a desperate need to act. Despite her horror, Romy called authorities and provided them with crucial information, including the warning about a dangerous family member. That statement, initially cryptic to outsiders, would later prove to be chillingly accurate. Romy's instincts identified the threat within the family itself, a recognition of danger that was tragically validated when investigators determined her brother, Nick, was responsible for the murders. From Romy's perspective, the event was not just about discovering her parents' deaths. It was about confronting a profound and intimate betrayal. The person responsible was someone she had known her entire life, someone she had loved, trusted, and grown up alongside. In crimes committed by family members, this element of betrayal intensifies the psychological impact, creating a mix of grief, shock, anger, and disbelief that is rarely experienced in other types of crime. Romy was now navigating a psychological landscape that was both unfamiliar and intensely painful. In the days and weeks that followed, Romy's perspective became central to the investigation. She provided detailed accounts of her interactions with Nick, her observations of family dynamics, and her own perceptions of warning signs that had gone unheeded. Investigators noted that her insights were invaluable, shedding light on the subtle but significant patterns of tension, resentment, and behavior that had characterized the Reiner household. Her testimony helped reconstruct not only the events of that day, but also the familial context in which they occurred. Romy's experience also highlights the broader emotional consequences for surviving family members in cases of intrafamilial homicide. The trauma she faced was multifaceted. She was processing the violent loss of her parents, grappling with the betrayal of a sibling, and confronting the intense media scrutiny that followed the tragedy. Psychologists have noted that such compounded trauma can result in long-term emotional and psychological challenges, including PTSD, anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting others, even those closest to the individual. Her perspective also brings attention to the small, often overlooked moments that foreshadowed tragedy. Romy later recounted subtle signs in Nick's behavior, mood changes, irritability, withdrawal, that in isolation seemed minor but, when viewed in context, hinted at deeper psychological and emotional unrest. These observations underscore a crucial aspect of intrafamilial crime. Often, warning signs exist, but they are difficult to interpret until after a catastrophic event has occurred. Romy's relationship with her parents provides additional insight into the dynamics of the household. She described them as loving, involved, and attentive, yet also as figures whose expectations could be high and whose standards were exacting. In this context, the family dynamic was a mixture of affection, discipline, and subtle pressure, conditions that, while manageable for some, may have contributed to Nick's escalating sense of frustration, isolation, or resentment. The emotional burden Romy carried was compounded by the role she played in alerting authorities. In a sense, she became both witness and participant in the immediate aftermath of the crime. Her observations guided law enforcement to consider her brother as the primary suspect, a realization that was both horrifying and necessary for justice to move forward. This dual role, survivor and informant, placed Romy in a position of immense psychological strain, highlighting the human cost of familial violence beyond the immediate victims. Romy's perspective also illuminates the contrast between public perception and private reality. To outsiders, the Reiner family had embodied wealth, sophistication, and harmony. Social media and news coverage emphasized their affluence and social prominence, portraying a family that had it all. Yet Romy's testimony revealed a more complex truth. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered, mental health concerns went largely unaddressed, and subtle warning signs were ignored or misunderstood. Her voice offers a rare and invaluable insight into the human realities behind the headlines.